present Professor Blaine Brownell, who is the Associate Professor at the University of Minnesota and Director of the Graduate Studies program there. His research is based on emergent materials and their impact on technology and sustainability. And he's published many books on the subject, including his Transmaterial series, and more recently, I believe it's the subject of his lecture tonight, Hypernatural, the architecture's relationship with nature. He has been interviewed for this year's Cathisma Journal, so I encourage you to pick up this year's copy and check out even more discussion with Blaine. But for now, please help me introduce Blaine Brownell.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to everyone from Cathisma Journal and Hopes and School of Architecture for having me. It's my first time here, and I never knew that at University of Oregon it's in the 80s and sunny all the time, so I already had a great reputation before I knew that, so this is really a lot. But just by way of introduction about the topic, Tom talked a little bit about my background and interest in emerging materials, and I became fascinated with new materials in practice. I was in practice full-time for about 7 years as an architect working in this part of the world, not here, but in Seattle. One who researches emerging materials, even at a superficial level, soon comes across or can't avoid the examples that are looking at natural systems, natural organisms, natural models. And so Hypernatural is a project that a colleague of mine, Mark Swackhammer, who's also at the School of Architecture at University of Minnesota, have been working on for a while. His background is in biomimicry and teaching biomimicry studios and trying to employ those techniques in design. And my background is looking at, again, emerging materials and new types of systems that look at natural models. So, and we co-authored a book on this topic, and this is the introductory quote that we decided to use, which is interesting because this is out of a book by Lewis Mumford. This is in the early 20th century that he's looking back at German economist Werner Sombart, who pointed out that the clue to modern technology was the displacement of the organic and the living by the artificial and the mechanical. So we might say very Western view, this kind of duality, right, between the artificial versus the living. Within technology itself, this process is being reversed. We're returning to the organic. At all events, we no longer regard the mechanical as all-embracing and all-sufficient. So what's interesting here is he highlights the duality. He calls attention to it. This is something that I think we can't escape. It's a paradigm that's deeply rooted within Western civilization. I think more so. It's pretty pervasive worldwide, but more so than, say, the Far East, which sees human-made and natural systems as being a little bit more cohesive or blended together. But suffice it to say that Mumford, even 100 years ago or so, is making reference to the fact that things are changing, right? That we're looking at the natural world differently, and its kind of relationship to the so-called technical or technological world. So this is kind of the premise that begins to describe this concept of hypernatural and where we see technology headed. So looking at, again, something like on the left, I'm trying to find a stereotypical kind of snapshot of mid-century, 20th century computing, right? Where you see lots of sort of mechanical systems, big clumsy boxes and tape machines, and what we associate with mechanics or something that's truly artificial or human-made as a computer, just taking one technology. On the right is microscopic photograph of a new computer it's very experimental, being designed by scientists at Tufts University using brain tissue that they've synthesized from mice. So this is a really incredible shift that's taking place now. Obviously, a lot of this work that I'll show is experimental, but moving from something that we've come to know as artificial or mechanistic, that's clearly something that at our scale we can perceive as having familiar pieces, like what we see on the left, moving towards something that's engineering life itself, working directly with the components of life. So eventually, if this, as far as we know, this research progresses at this rate, our future computers, whatever they might look like, will be powered by genetically engineered tissue. So the definition that we offer for hypernatural design here is working directly with natural forces and processes rather than against them in order to amplify, extend, or exceed natural capacities. So obviously technology has a negative side, right? We see in the sort of juggernaut of the industrial era and onward, and still today, a lot of the, all the toxicity, pollution, right? All of the energy resources, et cetera, that we've used technology to essentially harness in negative ways. There are negative outcomes. But our premise here is that technology isn't in itself bad, and in fact, we can use it to work with natural processes and forces rather than against them. And what's interesting, too, is biomimicry is a familiar topic, right? I think Janine Benyus has done a remarkable job to spread the word about really incredible work that's being done at multiple scales. Something we try to do in the book is to expand the discussion of biomimicry to the broader realities of what's happening in engineering, sciences, art and architecture, in various design fields, looking at not only living systems and how we might emulate them, but also looking at non-living systems, looking at both and working directly with them. So I'll go into more detail about that, but whether it's creating new solar cells with plant tissue or very small sort of climate-controlled spaces that harness clouds, envelopes that work like animal musculature, let's say, for buildings, or growing chairs out of crystals. There's a really incredibly fascinating change in design and technology-related disciplines that we're seeing. Designers and scientists, artists, et cetera, are looking more deeply at natural systems and trying to work more directly with them to make work. So just a few reminders to think about our paradigm and maybe where it falls short when we think about artificial versus natural. So some historians have looked at the extent to which evolutionary biology is actually replicated to some degree in design evolution. So Bashir-Dean, for example, has looked at the history of armaments. There was a New York Times article, I think a year or so ago, on looking at the evolution of the violin in terms of its form, in terms of its resonance. And obviously these are helmets, and violins are not living objects or entities, right? They're inert objects. We know that this analogy only goes so far. But what's interesting, and I think we could investigate further, is the nature of that evolution and how there are similarities, how there essentially is a mutation effect, right, that happens in design based on local context, conditions, access to resources, et cetera, local pressures, much like we see in the natural world. So one thing that interests us is as we look at the technology of nature, is looking at the nature of technology as well. And we can think not only of our systems as having particular goals and objectives and measurable performance on the left, you can see with the daylight piping system called PARANS, but also we could adopt a technological view of nature, right? We can just for hypothetical purposes, we can say in this Fenestraria plant, which harvests sunlight through, you can see the top oculus essentially is translucent on this plant, and so it magnifies and harnesses sunlight down into the tube where it photosynthesizes the energy. And so this is a kind of technology somewhat similar to the version on the left. So what does this mean for architecture? So I'll try to discuss, again, some more kind of paradigmatic thinking, as well as some examples of how we might push this further. So again, we think about the natural environment versus architecture, right? I think there's still that worldview that when we place something in nature, it is other, right? Or that nature is other somehow, the wild. And this is, I'm really trying to dispel that. And we don't have to look far. I mean, we can look at animals, obviously, as creating architecture of their own, like the termite mound, for example. There are many examples of this, using tools of their own, shaping the landscape on their own. So we might look at the left and say, well, is that a natural environment, completely natural environment? Well, sure, because we don't see any human influence, perhaps. Well, what about on the right? Is this stone house that makes optimal use of existing conditions in a very minimal way, is vernacular, a natural environment? I mean, we begin to raise interesting questions. We could also say that nature's been manipulated, modified continually by the animal kingdom, for example, in ways that forever shape it, much like what we've done. So we might look at, in a very superficial way, we might look at two ways that designers or people, let's say, from many different fields, work with nature, right? On the left is a type of mimicry. Biomimicry in its loosest or most general sense has actually been going on for, throughout recorded history, as far as we know. This is obviously a more current example, the turn of the century store front designed by Louis Sullivan. I mean, this is a formalist mimicry, right? Looking at plant fronds and manipulating them. Obviously, there's something else at work, right? Because this isn't, we have symmetry happening, we have kind of fanciful manipulations of the geometry. We can extend this into other areas. We can look at this in terms of operational mimicry as well. But on the right, we have something that we might call engagement. So this was a small pavilion at the Milan World Expo this summer that harvests energy through algae blooms, and it's called the Urban Algae Folly. So if you look, obviously this is a detailed image, right, a cropped image, so you can't see the whole pavilion. But the notion here is that we're engaging natural systems and processes, right? We're not trying to emulate the form of algae or even emulate the performance of algae. We're just, it's there, right? It's alive, it's doing the work. And so these are two ways we might begin to think about working with nature. But pretty soon we realize that the lines can easily be blurred. So in this really interesting project for the silk leaf, this designer infuses silk fibers with chloroplast, living chloroplast cells that photosynthesize light. So is it natural or is it artificial? Is it mimicking a leaf? It sure looks like it. Or is it engaging leaf-like performance, which it is, right? So the point of talking about the sort of dichotomy of mimicry versus engagement is really to show that is at best kind of a short-sighted way of looking at the world, and more we see designers and engineers, scientists working in this realm, essentially the kind of the spectrum in between those. So we offer some different suggested models of how we might think about working with nature in a slightly more, I guess, accurate way, but also still trying to keep things simple. And so one way we might think about working with natural systems is these properties, processes, and phenomena. So, and I'll have some examples to go through here. So properties would be to look at the inherent structure, the inherent logic of a natural system. In this case, looking at icicles on the upper right and the fluid dynamic properties at work. So scientists have determined that with icicles, much like with stalactites, they adhere to very similar geometric ratios, these kind of conical shape, inverted obviously, shapes based on the kind of slow speed of dripping water and how they become solid over time. And so looking at that property, right, fluid dynamics properties, we could say that Gunn architects who designed the water cathedral in a hot climate in the summertime using these fabric cones, some of which are liquid-filled, water-filled, that is one way that design can adhere to or try to emulate those properties, right? That those properties can inform the morphology, the performance of design. Has anyone seen this project? Roger Hjorn's project called Seizure. So he's an artist, and for this project, I don't know exactly how all the financing worked, but essentially was able to take control over a London flat in an apartment building and make it watertight and fill it completely with a mineral bath of copper sulfate crystals, copper sulfate powder, and water. And after a month's time, the crystals began to precipitate on all the hard surfaces. And then after that time, the mineral bath was drained, and this was the result. So interesting, right? Can you imagine trying to control this process? You don't know what's happening, right? It's set it up, let it go, and keep your fingers crossed. Obviously, this is a discursive project, right? No one lives in this apartment. And actually, it was so beloved that when the apartment building in which it was a part was slated for demolition, the entire apartment was moved to another dedicated site. So what's also interesting is that copper sulfate over time degrades in terms of its color, becomes sort of the dull hue as well. So there are processes that work at different time scales. But the point of this, what I'm trying to say here for this example, is that this is obviously a process. It's an experiment that's set up. The designer, in this case, acts as more like a scientist, right, to understand the behaviors of things, sets up the experiment, and allows this natural process to be a fundamental part of design. And in terms of phenomena, we're looking at real-time response, and we tend to look at things like climate, or if we're looking in the animal kingdom or plant kingdom, we're looking at tropism, we're looking at immediate types of muscle responses. In this case, this is RVTR's Stratus project, which is essentially a kind of undulating illuminated surface that has microsensors that detect human occupation of spaces, and then small micro fans. Well, so the sensors detect multiple properties or characteristics, the temperature of the individual, the amount of CO2 in the air, the movement of the individual. And so then fans will direct airflow towards the individual if the temperature is heating up or if there's too much CO2, and also illuminate near the individual. So it's an interesting system that essentially synthesizes a lot of different, what would typically be very disparate types of systems, right? Electrical, mechanical, and obviously the materiality of the ceiling into one cloud-like experience. So something, again, that senses and responses actively. So those three approaches cover a lot of ground, but life is unique, right? I mean, life does some amazing things that other natural systems that are not living don't do. And so we offer three other approaches for thinking about designing directly with life. As you can see here, these are the three, and I'll just go into more detail. So the mediated matter group's Silk Pavilion, for example, is one that exemplifies for us what we call behavioral approach. So behavioral is much like the process approach before. Behavioral is looking at biology and understanding its behavior more deeply to engage it in the design and construction process. So this really operates before construction, really understanding the operations. So in this case, the silkworm and its range of motion as it's weaving, understanding essentially how much silk it can produce in a given time period, were all things that the researchers studied. And then they created a scaffolding with some, you can see these threads were like pilot threads that the researchers and designers essentially stretched across the frame because they needed something, needed scaffolding or something on which to weave this pavilion. So then I forget how many silkworms were allowed to free roam across this surface and actually essentially infill it, and the scaffolding was removed. And this is a really interesting project. You think about the history of silk, it's to my knowledge, until now, always been just a resource extraction process, right? It's been about, we're going to harvest nature for what we want and then kill the worm and use, right? This is like a lot of things that we've done with nature. But in this case, silkworms are kind of being used like subcontractors on a project, right? And again, a lot of the work I'm showing is discursive, it's experimental, but increasingly, I think a lot of these very, very experimental types of projects will find their way into more mainstream work. The genetic approach looks at obviously the genetic makeup of something and its inherent properties, and goes into effect most fundamentally during construction. So again, very experimental work. These xylenum cones by Hulson and Schwab from Ireland are essentially kind of modular type components created from bacterial cellulose. So living microbial organism that when shaped and molded and dried can form various nesting objects. So this is, what would this be? I'm not sure where this research is going, but a really interesting way in looking at the genetic makeup of a living organism to understand its inherent structural capacities. And epigenetic is, again, similar to the phenomena work, but in this case looking at specifically at living organisms that respond to context post-construction. And so here is the hygroskin by Menges and collaborators, which is inspired by the spruce cone that opens and closes with changes in humidity. And so these are window apertures, effectively, that have very thin wood flitches that are designed and fabricated to open and close with changes in relative humidity between, I think it's like 30 and 80%. So that when climate changes, when the air gets wetter and drier, and the sun comes out, all of these forces will induce these apertures to open and close automatically. And what's interesting about this project, I mean, obviously these apertures are small, they're somewhat precious, but here we have a system. I mean, this I think relates to the discussion last night on the panel somewhat. Here we have an approach to having an envelope that is tuned to changes in the environment without any kind of electricity, mechanical systems. The material effectively is the system. So, again, I think it's important that we look at biology, but that we also frame the work that we do when we look at nature as a model more holistically. And so these are 7. Again, this is very simplified, right? It's very reduced. If you're a scientist, this is a pretty generic kind of assembly of different approaches, but looking at these different natural science domains as a reference point, because I think the terminology and a lot of the work that we're doing isn't always accurately referenced, right? I mean, I remember hearing people talk about, creating a crystal chair that's grown and it's biomimicry. Well, actually, it's not mimicking anything and it's not biological, right? So this is a way to try to understand what are the domains in which we can operate. And the noosphere on the right is something that's probably least discussed, I suppose, but we decided to try to take that on as well. The noosphere refers to the sphere of human thought and language, which, if we're natural organisms, presumably is a natural extension, right? It's a whole other domain. So just going through these spheres, if you will. So we can look at work like Tom Falder's geotube tower, which is a proposal to harness salt water from the Red Sea and then through this network of tubes to spray this salt water over time. So you can see in the upper right that the facade will essentially calcify over time and change in terms of its transparency and translucency. With atmosphere, we can see examples like Tetsuo Kondo and Transsolar's cloudscapes. This is something that I jokingly refer to as nanoclimate research because it's certainly smaller than a microclimate. And actually, that's not my term. That is actually a term. But looking at, it's incredible, right, to harness a cloud effectively within a relatively small confined space where, based on the amount of humidity that's brought into the space and how the temperature is controlled, then 3 strata, effectively, atmospheric strata, form within the space. Hydrosphere, I mentioned this briefly on the panel last night, but we see a lot more artists and engineers and architects even working with water in ways beyond, let's just keep it out of the building. Right. Obviously, this is an art piece. It's an interactive, immersive experience wherein sensors turn off the water spigots above you, right, so you don't get wet. But at the same time, you can experience what it's, like something akin to being in the middle of a rainstorm. There are other examples using digital controls and water. In terms of microbes, this is one of my favorite examples is this solar leaf vertical algae farm in a building facade. I just love how clever this idea is. If we can infuse in this sort of liquid infused medium within this IGU unit on the exterior of a building, especially in the sunniest, the sides of the building that have the most solar orientation, then algae will bloom naturally. As they bloom, the windows become more opaque, darker, providing shading that's necessary or desired for the interior occupants. And then the algae is harvested after it's matured for fuel to heat the building. And so it's a really interesting idea, again, using a living organism for something like shading a building and fueling a building. So nature in the service. This is not biomimicry. Again, this is a kind of biodesign or bioengineering. Another kind, but looking at the botanical world, is something like this, working with trees on this kind of architectural scale, right? Or with an architectural project in mind of a cathedral made out of vegetation. Obviously, we're working with natural timescales, right? This project becomes real at the pacing of the trees themselves, but really interesting way to blur the boundaries between the inert materials we might bring to creating a cathedral, like stone, for example, and living materials, blurring the boundaries between architecture, landscape architecture, horticulture. And one of my favorite examples for the zoological biosphere is this truffle sea house, where a calf named Paulina was brought in to essentially eat out the hay bales that were used as formwork for the project, so concrete cast around this project. And as the architects just explain the process, a very kind of ritualistic process, the Paulina became a mature adult cow in that process of eating all of the formwork. So what's typically a waste product of formwork that we just send to a landfill or something, becomes part of the metabolism of the animal. So Paulina's kind of a subcontractor in this case. And the noosphere is something I think we're still uncertain about where this goes, but it has to do, again, with the sphere of human thought, how we represent ourselves in the world and how we understand that, and that registers with us, and that's something we respond to. And a building that really resonated with me when I had a chance to visit at the Shanghai Expo in 2010 was Mass Studies Korean Pavilion, for the way that the architects used the Hangul alphabet and used it literally, used it in two ways. So it's legible here on these hand-painted steel panels, but then they abstracted the alphabet and you can see at multiple scales here into these kind of shapes of geometric radicals. And my Korean friends have explained to me that doesn't really mean anything. But what's fascinating is that these scales don't just operate, these are laser-cut aluminum panels here, don't just operate within this range, they actually operate at the entire scale of the building. So even the building itself takes on the structure of language. And I think, we think about Victor Hugo's short piece on This Will Kill That, and the book will kill the building, and the whole notion of, the text essentially obliterating the need for the building to be didactic. I think this is a really interesting way that an architect has tried to work directly with language and the space of language to create architecture. So what does this all mean? I have some other work to share that's essentially followed after the book, as well as some questions that we should consider for future work. Again, this was published last year, and then we had an exhibition at the University of Minnesota. And one of our objectives, in addition to clarifying approaches and natural domains, et cetera, was to try to create a dialogue between what otherwise very disparate types of work, right? Let's say between computer scientists and engineers, let's say geologists and artists and architects and graphic designers, for example, right? All working with nature in really innovative and interesting ways, but not necessarily talking to one another. And so this is a recent studio, is a half-semester studio, 7 weeks, that Mark and I ran at University of Minnesota, where we brought biologists into the studio, and they came. We had faculty and students that came once a week to work with groups of architect students. This is nothing new. I'm not claiming this is the first time this has been done. The Biomimicry Institute offers, and you may do this here too, but the Biomimicry Institute offers what they call biologists at the design table program. But I'm sharing this with you because it was the first time I've been part of this type of experience, and I learned some interesting things as a result. One thing I must say is that our faculty, as probably could be expected of any school of architecture, faculty members range from the opinion that doing a really interdisciplinary type studio is great experimental work, we should do it, to why are we doing this? This is not teaching fundamentals. And I think both sides are valid. But it was an interesting experiment because I think the students actually learned a lot of disciplinary skills, to me, through doing something with another discipline. And so I've just got a few projects to share just to kind of talk through some of these disciplinary things. And so one of the first highlights for me of doing this type of studio is that the students are immediately, I think, in a position to create novel ideas because they began the studio by looking at natural models immediately that address certain environmental problems like acoustics or lighting, light control, or what else? Storage, water manipulation, etc. So these students happened to they were interested in lighting and optics, and they were using the natural model of a cuttlefish and its skin. It's actually this little photo on the upper left doesn't do it full justice, but the skin is actually incredible in the sense that it has multiple layers and each layer regulates something different, like hue and reflectance, and there's one that even have luminous, phosphorescent abilities in some species, and so and they can also change texture. So essentially, kind of a bump map which is just really incredible. So the skin actually changes in terms of its form to project certain images, camouflage. So the students created a type of aperture that, with shape memory alloy, could automatically open and close. But what's interesting is that the kind of tessellated shape of this aperture becomes more volumetric as it opens. And I only go into this level of detail just to say that I would be willing to bet if we started the studio asking students just to look at purely architectural precedents and design something, that the level of novelty wouldn't have been there, right? If students are looking at natural systems, they're immediately in the realm of all this crazy stuff that happens, and as opposed to, a building has to have punched openings, and Also, the awareness of what architecture can create and the role of architects. And so this is a group of students that were speculating about using bamboo as a living organism, to grow a forest with a series of different types of architectural experiences. So essentially a landscape type project or a horticultural type project, but understanding the rhizomatic growth of the bamboo. The students work very closely with biologists to understand how, by changing the density of the plantings, the spacing, the orientation, et cetera, that they could create a series of different types of meditative spaces. And so it really forced them, because they're not using bricks, right, or studs, it really forced them to think more deeply about the spaces themselves and the series of using a very soft hand, a gentle hand, by changing, you can't really read this, but this is a graph to show by changing the nutrient content of the soil and the water content of the soil that you could affect different types of growth patterns, which is interesting. I found that students, when working directly with biologists, begin to assume the role of architects. They begin to act as architects, in my very subjective impression, more readily, because if you're just in a studio with other architecture students, you're not trying to outact one another. Who's the architect here, right? But if you're working directly with biologists, okay, I'm going to try to understand what this evolutionary biologist is telling me and work with this plant biologist, and then coordinate with my peers and try to really, absorb the information and synthesize it and design it into something new. So this is a team looking at the way that cacti harness water in places where there isn't much, and thinking about new types of building systems that harness and store water for future use. Interestingly, here's something that I love that happened is during one of the early reviews, the students were presenting their work. We have a panel of architects and biologists in the audience, and they talk about how the cactus works and how their thing is wrong, right? The biology experts stood up and just said, no, you're totally wrong. This isn't how it works. And what I loved is that the students, I mean, if that had been an architecture professor, they probably would have been all hurt and angry and like, this is total. But because they're working with an expert, in terms of the completely different discipline, they're just learning this in the first few days, right? Completely different discipline, to tell them how things, really work in that particular sphere. The students became, all they cared about is really trying to understand as much as possible. And in that, they also, to me, they really were acting the role, right? They were taking on the role, because we're not trying to take it personally, right? We just really want to understand the reality of the situation so we can move the design process forward. And the last project here is a student team that looked at pheromone trails, something that these are invisible to us, but essential to the communication of ants, right? Finding food sources, understanding navigation. And the students they speculated about these sensory floors. They could understand human presence over time, and they wrote programs that, they wrote programs that essentially visualize pheromone trails so we can understand how they work. And then they wrote programs for this interactive LED floor type system it became a kind of social experiment, right? Because after a while we're thinking, well, do I want to be monitored by a floor, or do I want to communicate to someone? Is this a wayfinding device, or it's not? It's just a way to presence, maybe over a 24-hour period, how many people have been in a space. And so this was really interesting disciplinarily, because the designers in the studio began to work with the biologists to open up new questions. And also they were also looking at other types of species that forage, and how the pheromone trail of the ant might relate to, let's say, other species that do something similar, that those biologists, because they're so specialized, aren't necessarily in dialogue with one another about those similarities. And so as synthesizers, integrators, and also I think taking the role of looking at new frontiers of knowledge, those are things that I think architects can be really good at. So shifting a little bit towards some open-ended questions, how does all this relate to environmental degradation, essentially the theme of this conference, hopes and what can we do? This is, I think, pretty new. I mean, obviously, if you read biomimicry texts, right, or articles, if you interview people doing biodesign or this type of work, you'll hear a lot of, well, if we work with nature better, if we learn about it more, we can make more sensitive work that's attuned to the environment. But really, I mean, I think the most important thing, I mean, we're really just scratching the surface. We don't know yet how this work will play out. And I think the most important thing is that it opens up a lot of new questions related to fundamental approaches and paradigms. And so for me, one question, and for several years I co-directed our MS and Sustainable Design program, and sustainable design and whatever that means to you is something that means a lot to me too. But this has, the slide represents a frustration that I've had with so-called sustainable design, is that there's so much what we might call left brain work, right? How do I understand life cycle assessment and check the boxes on these lead checklists and understand boundary conditions, and I mean all this stuff is important. But I feel like design has been largely left out of sustainable design. Now that's not entirely fair and it's not entirely true, but one question is, what happened to design? Can we bring design more, or right side of the brain, more into dialogue with the quantitative approach to sustainability? I think there's been a huge lost opportunity in not only the design of sustainable architecture and buildings, but also the promotion of that. Anytime we see the kind of builder home that prides itself on having sustainable features that you don't notice, right? You can drive a Prius and live in this home that otherwise looks whatever, stereotypical, and you're green, right? This is an opportunity. I mean, working with natural systems and nature is a tremendous opportunity to push design forward. We shouldn't try to hide it. Nature doesn't apologize, right? Nature doesn't try to... Nature isn't worried about the neighbor next door and property values and working with local design codes. And I'm being a little bit... This is my soapbox rant. But, I mean... and obviously nature is a whole lot of things, right? More than just the lionfish. But I think you know what I'm saying. It's just the exuberance, all the incredible types of forms and the types of performance that we see in the natural world. Those are things that we should learn more about and try to emulate at a deeper level. Another question is beauty. How many times do you talk about beauty? Or have you heard architects talk about beauty? I mean, we love beauty, right? Why? Beauty's great. But what is it, right? This is an image, I think I did a Google search for beauty, architecture, nature. I mean, maybe this isn't your idea of beauty, but I think what frustrated me in practice especially is the extent to which architects say, well, we want to make something beautiful. Well, of course we do. And even the Living Building Challenge has a pedal for beauty, right? But what is that? It's so subjective, right? And I totally appreciate natural beauty. I mean, I really do. But I think we need to question, what do we mean by beauty, and what kind of effects are we trying to create? Not just buy into it. Oh yeah, of course, we're going to do something beautiful. Because, nature isn't all bunnies and meadows, right? And flowers. I mean, nature is full of cataclysm and horror and terror and just what might be to some plain ugliness. But what's beautiful to me about all of these things, as scary as they might be or strange or whatever, is that they're beautiful systems, right? So I think, this is another suggestion, is that we look more deeply at performance and at the systemic structures of things rather than just buy into the idea of beauty superficially. Another dichotomy that this thinking questions is one that we've created, right? Design versus technology. There are obviously different permutations of this, but we talk about this all the time, right? Architects of practice talk about this all the time. A design architect, a technical architect. We kind of have ideas about what design is and what technology is. But if we were to look at nature as a design project or as a technical project, you can't separate design and technology in the human eye, right? Or peacock feathers or a tortoiseshell or whatever. I mean, you really do see form and function deeply intertwined in these things. And it's not just lip service. It's not just trying to fit the ductwork somewhere that no one will see it. Right? It's deeply, deeply, fundamentally integrated. We talk about integrated design, but it's really just, it's at a, I guess, not to be harsh, because it's important to do integrated design, but I think the way that a lot of people practice it is just ensuring that beams and ducts don't interfere with one another, but we can do better. So what's really exciting about all this work is that we see a re-engagement with the design process itself at the level of materiality, for example, essentially reformulating materials, rethinking materials, trying to understand how do we create materials that are more supple, flexible, adaptable, perhaps lifelike, like these hydrocolloid digitally fabricated surfaces. How do we work with nature rather than simply use it, co-opt its resources, right? Kill it off. How do we work with living systems like silkworms in partnership? The emphasis here is, again, in the design process, is very much a process of discovery rather than creating a kind of predetermined vision. And that process can lead to new forms of construction. And ultimately, I think the goal here is, in our own humble way, to try to harness some of the incredible profundity and inherent enchantment and also just the raw wonder of our natural and original environment. Thank you.
And if we have time for about 5 minutes for questions, so no one has a question for Blaine.
Yeah, so you kind of put forth this framework for, can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit.
So you put forth this framework for design things, but I was wondering, what would you consider like bioengineering in that framework, or like kind of divorced from it? So that would be like genetically engineering silkworms or something, so that they would create certain color silk or like silk in a certain pattern. Where would you find? Like, do you support that, or do you think like that kind of engineering is the antithesis of what you're looking for?
So, and I want to make sure I understand your question. Is the question more about design versus or architecture versus engineering, or is it more about the ethical treatment of animals towards some outcome?
Well, yeah, I guess it's more towards that, but I guess like what you would consider as like part of this like natural design process. Is it simply harnessing what's already there, or taking it another step further?
Well, I think it's really early innings in a lot of ways. I mean, we've worked with the natural world for, before history, right? Before recorded history, and we've emulated it. We've obviously used its resources. We've worked with living systems and creatures. So, this is actually one of the oldest lectures. Oldest themes, rather, in a sense. But a lot of there's a kind of return and looking at natural systems at a much deeper level that we're seeing with multiple disciplines. So to me, I mean, my lens is architecture and design a little bit more broadly outside of that. And so a lot of the examples that I showed have spatial, right, dimension and certainly design dimension. But I mean, so my first answer would be yes. I think, the example that you discussed would be part of the larger realm. But what we're also seeing disciplinarily is that, and I know it's trite, right? Do more interdisciplinary work. We're hearing that all the time. But some pretty amazing things happen with those when disciplines begin to converge. And I think that if engineers are just looking at a particular solution to manipulate a protein, whatever, that might certainly be, I mean, I don't know, that might be groundbreaking work. But I think when that comes into contact with design proposals of what that could be used for, or maybe social sciences, how might people interact with that, et cetera, then I think it becomes really productive and really intriguing and engaging, and certainly would be part of this. Does that answer the question? Okay.
No more? Okay. Well, thank you again, Blaine, for coming.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
If you want to hear more from Blaine and Sean and some of our other speakers this year, I encourage you all to attend the panel happening in room 206 at 7 o'clock. We'll be discussing the future design